Yikes, Congressman. So the president protecting his son at the expense of maintaining public trust in the Justice Department is the tension that some are seeing there. If people think it's always political, they may not think Trump is a unique threat, and they might just kind of shrug rather than care to resist when he turns the Justice Department into merely an extension of his interests. How much do you agree or disagree?
So I do agree that President Biden should not have stated that he would not pardon Hunter Biden, especially after the plea agreement fell through. And I think that's a critical aspect of this case. In a almost unprecedented fashion and completely inappropriate, Republicans in Congress tried to intervene in Hunter Biden's ongoing criminal case to sabotage and submarine a plea agreement that they felt, in their esteemed wisdom, was not satisfactory, even though they, of course, have no idea what the evidence is. In part because of their efforts to intervene, and in part because the plea agreement was unusual because of fear of retribution if Donald Trump were to become president. The plea agreement fell apart, and ultimately Hunter Biden was charged with crimes that no one else would have been charged with. And now, as we stand here, and Donald Trump is putting Matt Gaetz and Pam Bondi and Kash Patel in charge of the Department of Justice and the FBI, all of whom have declared their desire to weaponize the Department of Justice, and specifically in Kash Patel's part against Hunter Biden. That is the politicization of this case. And it is not necessarily that the Biden DOJ did anything that was politicized, because I think the original plea agreement was a very fair resolution, and obviously the Biden DOJ thought that as well. But once the plea agreement fell apart, there's no way that the prosecutor can just simply end the investigation without moving forward with any good faith basis. And so ultimately Hunter Biden was charged with crimes that anyone whose last name was not Biden would not have been charged with. And so it's not that the Biden DOJ is politicized. It's that this case was so politicized by the Republicans and by ultimately Donald Trump and his future nominees, who will take over the Department of Justice and have threatened to charge Hunter Biden with additional crimes that the Department of Justice already declined to charge him with. And that is where President Biden thinks it's politicized and unfair, and I agree with that.
You're raising some interesting nuances to this story that may get lost on a lot of people who don't look at it that closely. But can you cite evidence for the main charge in what you just said, which is that, if I heard you correctly, Republican members of Congress had enough sway with the supposedly independent counsel, David Weiss, who was first appointed by President Trump at the time to look into Hunter Biden, and then retained by President Biden to stay on and continue to look into possible crimes by his son. Are you saying that rather than being independent, that prosecutor was swayed by political pressure by Republicans in the House of Representatives to go back on a plea agreement that he had made with Hunter Biden?
No, I don't think he went back on the plea agreement. I think he tried to defend the plea agreement in court. It gets complicated and nuanced, as you point out, but the pressure from Republicans in a completely inappropriate, and talk about weaponization of their authority in Congress to intervene in a completely separate criminal prosecution, totally inappropriate and unwarranted. I do think that highlighted this plea agreement, and that caused further scrutiny of the plea agreement. That was unusual, but it was unusual because of the threat of retribution by Donald Trump, not by anything else.
So who scuttled it?
Sorry?
Who scuttled it?
Well, ultimately, I think everybody takes some responsibility for scuttling it. I think the judge didn't accept it as is. My suspicion is Hunter Biden's team would not accept a would not take a plea agreement if he did not have immunity from additional crimes such as FARA, which Kash Patel has declared without seeing the evidence that Hunter Biden violated, as well as money laundering, which they allege. Jamie Comer seems to think he's an expert on criminal prosecution, and he has said that he's committed money laundering. And so if you don't get protection and immunity from that, then Hunter Biden said, I'm not going to plead guilty and accept responsibility, and ultimately force the hand of David Weiss to either drop the charges or to move forward with charges that are never charged.
And that's why the president pardoned Hunter, not just for anything he was convicted of, but also for anything else he may have done during the recent years up until this moment, because of the possibility that Kash Patel, as Attorney General, will go after him again for older things?
Yes, specifically for FARA violations and for money laundering, which he was not charged with. But Republicans have cited over and over that he should be charged with. So, look, I think that I sincerely do not think that President Biden would have pardoned Hunter Biden if that original plea agreement and the arrangement that they had agreed to would ultimately carry the day. But after that fell through because of Republican intervention and the threat of Donald Trump, this case is now outside the norm.
I said Kash Patel as Attorney General. Obviously, I mean Kash Patel as FBI Director, Ken Bondi as Attorney General. We spoke in detail on yesterday's show with reporter David Rogue from NBC News about ways in which they want to, and Trump wants to, make the Justice Department more of an extension of the president's interest and less independent. But for you as a lawyer and a student of these things, what is the proper balance between independence and accountability to the president, in your opinion, of the Justice Department? The Republicans will argue, for example, that, hey, look, JFK appointed his brother as Attorney General, and Obama had Eric Holder, who called himself, while he was in office, the president's wingman.
But neither JFK nor President Obama intervened or directed any specific criminal investigations. And I think that's where the line has to be drawn. There's no question that the Attorney General is an appointee of the President, and from a policy perspective, in terms of what areas to focus on, where to put resources, what policies to pursue, the President should have a role in defining that. But where the line must be drawn is on specific criminal investigations and prosecutions. And the president must have nothing to do with any of those cases, those investigations. And that's where the line should be drawn. And that's Donald Trump violated that line, according to the New York Times, or at least tried to, 10 times in his first term, and has promised now to do it again, and has put in political lackeys who are generally unqualified in order to set himself up to do it again.
And I saw you on News 12 as a congressman from New York saying you're worried Trump will use his revenge and retribution tour, as you called it, against New York in particular. What do you mean by revenge and retribution tour, and what are you envisioning with respect to New York?
Well, this is a president who withheld disaster relief from Puerto Rico and California because they didn't vote for him. And that was in the first term. Now, he's furious, and he has been very vocal at the Manhattan DA and the New York Attorney General at New York, and he, what I believe, is poised to use his authority to punish New York. To punish New York City, to withhold aid, withhold funding, to potentially look to isolate New York or states similar to New York, like he did with the SALT tax deduction, where he tried to punish blue states by limiting that deduction and help red states. Donald Trump views everything through a partisan lens. There isn't a single part of his job that he thinks is nonpartisan. And I am concerned that with his power as president and his anger and vengefulness towards New York City and New York State generally, that he will use that power to punish our city and state.
How specifically?
Well, I mean, there are numerous bills that were passed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration: the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act. The administration decides where a lot of that money goes. And if President Trump just decides and directs his various agencies not to give any grants to New York City and New York, that is one way that he could do this. And that would be devastating for New York City. It would be devastating for the state. And it would be simply because he is angered and upset with New York. That would have a really serious detrimental impact on so many of the things that we are trying to do to improve New York City and to improve New York State.
We took a long detour there from the 22nd Amendment, and I want to just cycle back to that very briefly and put a pin in that topic, and then we'll go on to other things, like Speaker Mike Johnson's recent threat to undo Obamacare. So we'll see what you, as a Democratic member of the House of Representatives, think is actually likely to come down the pipe there and what you might do about it. But on your resolution to have Congress reaffirm the 22nd Amendment, I mean, it already exists, and it's clear about the two-term limit in the U.S. Constitution for a President of the United States. It doesn't matter, according to the text, whether the terms are continuous or broken up like Trump's. It says no person shall be elected president more than twice. So you're a lawyer. Are you just drawing attention to Trump's words with this resolution, or do you think it's actually needed to secure that provision of the Constitution?
The Republicans are in control of both the House and the Senate, and Donald Trump is going to be president. If there is going to be a resistance to Donald Trump's effort to undermine our Constitution, to dismantle our federal government, to sabotage our democracy, it is going to have to come from Republican members of Congress and Republican senators, because they have total control. And so this resolution is an opportunity for Republicans to go on record and to declare that they will have fealty to the Constitution, because they take an oath to the Constitution and not to Donald Trump. It should be very simple, as you point out, for them to simply say, yes, that's what the Constitution says. But they're resistant and reluctant to doing that. And so this is an effort to call them out and to make sure that they go on record as affirming and reaffirming what the plain text of the Constitution says, so that this idea of Donald Trump staying on after 2028 is not normalized.
We'll continue in a minute with Congressman Dan Goldman, Democrat from Brooklyn and Manhattan. We'll talk about Obamacare in the new Congress. We'll talk about mass deportation in New York City. And listeners, we can take some phone calls for him, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. We'll get in a few phone calls or texts for Congressman Goldman. Stay with us.
For Christmas week, the local fire company came and they pumped like 3 feet of the toxic forever chemical foam onto the grass. For snow, 300 campers were in. It was a free-for-all, breaking ankles, eyes are burning. So great.
Join us for stories of the follies of youth. That's the Moth Radio Hour from PRX.
Tonight at 9 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
Support for WNYC comes from City Meals on Wheels, a lifeline for 22,000 older New Yorkers. City Meals delivers meals in connection to those in need and is working to end elder hunger by 2040. More information on how to help at citymeals.org. NYU Skirball, presenting Nature Theater of Oklahoma's No President, and over-the-top comedy set to Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker as a quirky security team guards a mysterious show, December 5th through 7th. More at nyuskirball.org. AARP New York City is a supporter of WNYC Centennial, helping New York's public radio station reach hundreds of thousands of engaged listeners who have made WNYC part of their daily routine. More at WNYC.org/100.
On tomorrow's Bedminster show, we'll have a little fun with the sports writer Jane McManus, who is the editor of this year's edition of the Best Sports Writing Anthology for 2024. So we'll spotlight some of those stories, plus the latest on what's happening in South Korea after the president sparked chaos and a backlash when he declared martial law and then reversed it a few hours when Parliament voted to overrule him. We wonder, too, if there's some echoes in that for the United States and what might happen here. Trump has already talked about declaring all kinds of state of emergencies. Maybe martial law is even in the back of his head. Are there any lessons for the United States from what's happening in South Korea right now? That and more on tomorrow's Brian Noah Show.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Right on WNYC with Brooklyn and Manhattan Congressman Dan Goldman, now elected to his second term, and weighing in on all kinds of policy and democracy matters. We've been talking about his resolution to affirm that the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution exists. We've been getting his reactions to President Biden's pardon of Hunter Biden. And before we go on to issues of the economy and mass deportation and maybe a couple of other things, Congressman, people are calling about pardons. And Gary in Brooklyn, I think, wants Biden to issue more pardons before he leaves office. Gary, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yeah, these would be very strategic pardons, geared for basically addressing Trump and Patel's enemy list, and Trump can do for them exactly what he did for his son. Issue pardons covering the last 10 years for Hillary Clinton, Merrick Garland, Fiona Hill, Eric Holder, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole list. It's easy to find, and would prevent Trump and Patel from attacking these people, which seems to be their goal for the next administration, and force them to do their real jobs, which they seem intent, in fact, on not doing. And this would be pretty easy, pretty straightforward. It doesn't sound great, but it's appropriate, and we should call their bluffs. Democrats should start acting a little bit like Republicans when appropriate, and for good purposes, not for evil purposes.
Gary, thank you. And Congressman, I'll mention that we have at least 3 callers on the board with versions of that same question.
It's a very good point. I'm reluctant to encourage the president to take official action in some ways to legitimize those threats. Unlike in the Hunter Biden case, there are no specifics. There is no ongoing investigation. There was no investigation that would ultimately result in, prosecution, at least as of now. But the threat is real. I agree with you. And it's something, I would understand some consideration. I'd be very reluctant to do it if there were not specific indication of specific crimes or specific activity that would be investigated, that would be within the statute of limitations, etc. Because I don't think that the pardon power should be abused and should be politicized. I think that's very important for it to remain as apolitical as possible. I do think that President Biden needs to use his pardon authority much more aggressively for many other Americans who deserve clemency and who deserve perhaps a second chance because of extended nonviolent sentences that we, in many cases, realize now were probably too long. And I think there are other applicants and other individuals who have demonstrated a clear need, or at least a legitimacy for a pardon, a legitimate claim for a pardon. And so I hope that President Biden does aggressively use his pardon power with some of the same empathy that he clearly feels for his son about many, many other Americans who were either wrongly prosecuted or excessively sentenced.
Moving on to another topic, and Gary, thank you for your call. You've referred to the SALT tax cap, the state and local taxes deduction cap of $10,000 on your federal income taxes, as a Trump first-term policy to punish blue states. Retribution at that time, because New Yorkers pay more than $10,000, more than people in other states in state and local taxes, so they get more financially hurt by capping that deduction. He indicated during the campaign that he might be open to repealing it, and some local Republicans like Mike Lawler from north of the city say they are very determined that be in any new tax bill or economy bill. Do you see that coming? Repeal of the SALT cap, deduction cap?
Brian, it's a great question. It's probably better directed to Mike Lawler than me, because the Republicans are going to move under reconciliation to address the tax cuts that are expiring this year. And I think every single New Yorker should pay.
And reconciliation means the Senate wouldn't need 60 votes, it would only need 51 votes. Go ahead.
Right, and would just need a straight majority in the House as well. And so the Republicans have the majority. It's a very slim majority. But if people like Mike Lawler or Andrew Garbarino or Nick LaLota are going to actually come through on their promises to lift that deduction, they have the votes to do that. And so the question is, are they going to roll over like they did in this past Congress and cede all power and control to the extreme right wing of their party? Or are they going to stand up for what they believe in and what they have promised their constituents in New York, as well as other Republicans in New Jersey and California and other blue states generally, where this has a much greater impact? And if so, they can get it done. But if not, then that will be very reflective of their ability to serve their constituents.
Another factor there, though, is that those blue states, why do people have so many state and local tax dollars to deduct? They are relatively wealthy states. They are